Intelligence is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used to build hospitals or to pick locks, to discover cures or to design better cons. When the raw horsepower of a brilliant mind meets charisma, opportunity, and weak systems, the result can be awe-inspiring or catastrophically destructive. Tonight, we follow 5 very different stories. A teenage imposter who learned to read people, a Wall Street insider who turned trust into a factory of lies, a century-old showman who gave a name to a kind of fraud, a charismatic founder who sold hope in the language of science, and a cloud of anonymous code that raids the modern economy. For each, we'll go back to childhood, trace the small experiments that became dangerous arts, watch a pattern of mistakes and escalations, and listen to what law enforcement, the press, and the accused had to say when the curtain finally fell. Frank William Abagnale Jr. arrived in the world on April 27, 1948, in Bronxville, New York. He was the son of a stationery salesman and, by many accounts, an unusually observant child. Teachers remembered a boy who could memorize phone numbers at a glance and who loved puzzles and mimicry. His household was not troubled in the sensational way movies like to show, but a painful family fracturing. The divorce of his parents during adolescence left him with a sense of instability and the practical need to survive on his own. The first true experiments began small and almost petty. A teenager learning which signatures looked real, which bank clerks barely lifted their heads when processing a routine check. The early mistakes were inevitable: a bad forgery that bounced, a forged ID rejected by a suspicious teller. Those failures taught him the trade craft, how much detail a clerk needed before they raised an alarm, which uniforms drew less scrutiny, and how to shape confidence so it could substitute for credentials. Those small tactical errors became the laboratory. He learned in public. A failed pass at a small Midwestern bank taught him to always include a plausible backstory. A clerk's question taught him a new trigger phrase that shut down cursory verification. The pattern is common among social engineers. Early, low-stakes probes refined the tools. By his late teens, Abagnale escalated. He wasn't simply forging checks, he was designing social experiences that short-circuited trust. He studied uniforms, how a pilot moved, how a doctor carried a chart, and he studied paperwork, the exact spacing of timetables and the jargon of certifications. He learned how to influence the heuristic shortcuts people use. A crisp uniform triggers a script in a gate agent's mind. A confident voice gives authority. A plausible itinerary reduces suspicion. His mistakes became rarer because he was constantly iterating. Where one impersonation failed, he improved the script. Where a forged check revealed a new verification step, he updated his templates. His captures were messy, international, and, in later retellings, often exaggerated. Police records show arrests and time in custody in Europe and the United States. Archival documents place him in prisons at certain times that do not always match every cinematic anecdote he later told. That tension is important. Abagnale's memoirs and public persona grew into legend, and some of his most cinematic escapes are disputed by researchers. The reality, however, is still striking. He was arrested, brought through extraditions and sentences, and then, in a twist of institutional pragmatism, offered a narrow, ironic redemption: work with the FBI to teach them how con artists think. The man who exploited trust became a teacher of it. His own words in later interviews are revealing, not for contrition so much as for analysis. He described his acts as a mental chess game and emphasized the techniques:
reading micro-expressions, rehearsing jokes that disarmed, structuring documents to pass a casual glance. Psychologists who study his case point to the convergence of working memory, verbal fluency, and a capacity for emotional detachment that let him perform these social experiments without the paralysis many people feel at the ethical crossroads. The lesson Abagnale leaves is not the glamour of impersonation, but the thinness of the seam where institutional trust is stitched. Small procedural lapses, predictable social scripts, and people under time pressure. Across decades and a very different social cast, Bernard Lawrence Madoff arrived in Queens on April 29, 1938, into a household where small investments and spreadsheets were talked about at the dinner table. He was a boy who loved numbers and a young man who learned that reputation could be a currency. He learned the mechanics of the market and the social mechanics of wealth, who talks to whom, what associations lend credibility, and which phrases make a spreadsheet look conservative. Madoff's early experiments were not flamboyant, they were administrative. He learned what paperwork auditors wanted to see and how financial language reassured institutional risk managers. The early mistakes were not spectacular frauds, but small theatrical acts of omission, an inconsistent ledger entry here, a delayed reconciliation there. Over time, he and his firm developed a reputation for steadiness, and that reputation itself became a lever. That pattern, using perceived reliability as a cloak, is a hallmark of large-scale fraud. The escalation came when he stopped trying to pretend to trade and instead manufactured the illusion of trading. He constructed statements, invented trades, and used new money to pay old investors. In private, he ran an internal world of fabricated records and a choreography of silence. The errors that almost undid him were banal. The market crash of 2008 created a bank-run scenario in the investor world. Clients needed to withdraw, and the inflows that had been propping up the system evaporated. That imbalance produced an arithmetic impossibility. Regulators, auditors, and eventually journalists followed a trail of empty rooms and spreadsheets to a point of exposure. His arrest in December 2008 was swift, and his courtroom verdict and sentence, 150 years, were meant to be both punishment and cautionary spectacle. Madoff's public statements, as much as his guilty plea, show a man who acknowledged a systematic betrayal. Where Abagnale's craft relied on social mimicry, Madoff's deception relied on institutional opacity and social networks. Wealthy investors trusted him because other wealthy investors did. The media response was thunderous. Papers framed the story as not just a crime against individuals, but a tremor in public trust. Retirement funds collapsed, charities lost lifelines, entire philanthropic projects dimmed when their endowments evaporated. What psychology tells us about Madoff is that his skills were less theatrical and more cognitive engineering. He had an exceptionally strong working memory and procedural discipline to keep numerous fraudulent narratives running in parallel. He was able to design accounting artifacts that fit the heuristics auditors used, to model investor psychology, and to keep the system stable until the external shock removed the props. The small early mistakes, a missed reconciliation, a suspicious client request left unanswered, accumulated into a failure mode only visible when the system was stressed beyond its designed tolerances. If Madoff's fraud was a modern cathedral of deception, Charles Ponzi's was the foundational parable. Born in 1802 in Lugo, Italy, Ponzi came to the United States as a young immigrant hungry for opportunity. His early years in America featured small hustles, mismatches of expectation, and a restless intelligence that evaluated systems for gaps rather than following them. The first small attempts were almost comic. Small arbitrages, phone calls to banks, letters promoting non-existent returns. He learned quickly which stories attracted depositors and where the doubt lay. Ponzi's rise was rapid because the pattern he exploited was human and timeless, an offer that seemed both spectacular and simple.
If this exploration into brilliant minds and their dangerous capacities moved you, subscribe to the channel, hit like, and ring the bell.
His promise of 50% returns in 45 days was mathematically impossible at scale, but it used human fascination with novelty and the social proof of early payouts. Like every fraud artist, Ponzi made small errors as he scaled. He trusted intermediaries too much, underestimated the appetite of journalists, and failed to prepare for the inevitable cognitive dissonance when the math.
Investigative journalists, for whom the Ponzi story became a professional triumph, pried at the ledger and discovered the absence of legitimate arbitrage. In 1920, federal agents closed the book. Ponzi, in later interviews, claimed he never intended enormous harm. He framed his actions as ambition misapplied. The press at the time is instructive. Early giddy headlines that celebrated apparent financial ingenuity turned quickly into exposés and denunciations. Ponzi's mistake, in the language of modern behavioral science, was to rely on a narrative so thin that a single skeptical inquiry would topple it. The human lesson from Ponzi's era is that scams don't require sophisticated technology. They only require persuasive stories, social contagion, and a slow evaporation of skepticism. Elizabeth Holmes's path to deception begins in a different neighborhood of talent. Born February 3, 1984, in Washington, D.C., Holmes grew up in a home where ambitious educational and professional expectations were a kind of oxygen. She was academically precocious, capable of reading complex scientific literature, and astonishingly adept at rhetorical shaping. The ability to cast a technical claim not as a tentative experiment, but as a decisive narrative. Her earliest experiments were startup style. Prototype devices, late nights in labs, persuasive pitch decks. The first failures were technical, devices that gave inconsistent readings, assays that lacked sufficient sample validation. Those failures were manageable at a lab scale, but Holmes's personality had an element that would prove dangerous. She combined high executive function with a keen talent for narrative persuasion and an intolerance for public doubt. Instead of publishing incremental results and opening her methods to peer review, she cultivated secrecy. That secrecy removed a key safeguard, peer verification. Her mistakes multiplied as she scaled. Early lab technicians raised concerns about device reliability. Internal memos show managers pushing back on data that did not fit the preferred narrative. But by then, a powerful constellation of social proof had coalesced. Prominent board members, some political backing, celebrity investors, and a media willing to tell a compelling story about a young female founder in a male-dominated field. The deception worked because it exploited cultural biases, the hunger for a tidy story about disruption, and a charismatic leader who fit an archetype. The Wall Street Journal's investigation in 2015 was the decisive external probe. Reporters followed documents, interviewed whistleblowers, and demonstrated that Theranos often routed samples to conventional machines while promoting the illusion of proprietary accuracy. Regulators moved in. Federal prosecutors eventually brought charges, and a jury convicted Holmes on multiple counts. Her public statements after conviction mixed denial, remorse, and an insistence that she had believed in the mission. Her case is, in many ways, the quintessential modern fraud, not a street hustle, but a systemic manipulation of institutions, brand, and scientific deference. Psychologists who study her behavior note a profile that mixes high verbal intelligence, a capacity for strategic impression management, and an ability to model audiences' expectations. Neuroscience gives us the mechanism: strong frontal lobe planning that can maintain complex narratives, combined with social cognitive faculties that craft an emotional arc investors want to buy. The mistakes that unspooled Holmes's myth were social and procedural: over-reliance on secrecy, neglect of independent validation, and the classic human error of letting narrative precede evidence. Finally, consider a different species of criminal mind: the distributed, anonymous code-writing operator who never needs to don a uniform or sign a paper. The Lazarus Group, widely attributed by cybersecurity experts to actors in North Korea, demonstrates how collective technical intelligence and social engineering converge in the modern era. Their members are not a single charismatic face. They are teams, coders, logisticians, money movement specialists, and social engineers. Their early experiments were reconnaissance, probing networks for weak passwords, testing phishing angles on targeted employees, and learning which financial rails would yield the largest returns with the least attention. Their mistakes, when they occur, are instructive: sloppy money laundering chains that leave traceable trails, phishing templates that were reused across targets, or a malware variant that revealed a code signature. But they learn fast. When one attack fails, they collect the telemetry and adapt. The attacks that made headlines, the Sony Pictures breach, the WannaCry ransomware campaign, and the monumental thefts from cryptocurrency bridges and exchanges, show not just technical craft, but strategic patience and an understanding of global financial behavior. They time attacks to when liquidity is highest, exploit human rituals like payroll runs or settlement cycles, and craft fake social narratives to distract defenders. Investigations by the FBI, Europol, and private security firms attribute a pattern: consistent code reuse, command and control techniques, and economic exfiltration strategies that match what we would expect of a state-sponsored program with institutional backing. The media response frames Lazarus as both a national security threat and the epitome of a new intelligence problem: anonymous, agile, and difficult to prosecute because it crosses borders and jurisdictions. If we step back and look across these 5 stories, the recurring anatomy of deception emerges. Childhood curiosity becomes adult expertise. Small experiments in dishonesty reveal procedural weak points. Early mistakes produce iterative learning. Social environments reward risk and silence rather than skepticism, and systems, banks, journals, corporate boards, or digital exchanges have cognitive and procedural blind spots that can be weaponized. From a prevention perspective, the scientific literature is clear. Knowledge inoculation, institutional friction, and distributed verification are potent defenses. Teach people to slow down the heuristic engines of decision-making. Require multi-party approvals on high-risk transactions. Demand independent replication of scientific claims, and make auditing continuous and visible. Intelligence does not disappear when used ethically. It becomes the basis of stronger systems. When the arrests come, for Abagnale sporadic, for Madoff dramatic and judicial, for Ponzi swift in the face of investigative journalism, for Holmes the result of patient reporting and federal inquiry, for many Lazarus operators elusive attribution and sanctions, the theater of consequence begins. The media's role is paradoxical. They build celebrities, then burn them. Newspapers once loved Ponzi, and Holmes's early adulation was intense. The same presses later led the revelations that brought those figures down. Law enforcement oscillates between punishment and pragmatism. Abagnale's recruitment by the FBI was a pragmatic gamble. Madoff's prison sentence was retributive. Holmes's trial became a cautionary lesson for venture ecosystems. Lazarus is pursued across networks and diplomacies. What did those accused say when the spotlight turned on them? Their testimonies vary, but they share patterns. Some, like Abagnale, leaned into pragmatic explanations, emphasizing survival and later contrition with technical insights. Others, like Madoff, offered remorse and the confession that the structure he built was unsustainable and morally indefensible. Ponzi framed his actions as overreaching ambition. Holmes often insisted on belief in her mission while acknowledging a spiral that exceeded control. Lazarus, organized under state cover, offers no public contrition. Attribution and sanction are the instruments of statecraft. The science and the stories converge on a single warning and a single injunction. Intelligence can build or it can break. The difference is design. Systems designed to test, to verify, and to create friction will force even the cleverest manipulator to expend unsustainable resources to succeed. Systems that reward charisma and quick growth without checks will cultivate the exact environment where intelligent deception thrives. So what should you, as a viewer and as a citizen, do? Slow down before you trust. Demand documentation, peer review, and multi-step verification for big claims, whether in finance, health, or digital security. Teach the new generation about cognitive biases and the tactics of social engineering.
And when someone does get caught, read beyond the spectacle. Study the small errors, the missed audits, the cultural incentives that allowed the deception to grow. That is how systems get better. If this exploration into brilliant minds and their dangerous capacities moved you, subscribe to the channel. Hit like and ring the bell, because the next episodes will dig even deeper. Tell us in the comments, if you had the mental power and the skills of one of these figures, which path would you choose? Healing or harm? Be honest. The point of this inquiry is not to romanticize genius, but to study it, to understand it, and to make better choices as individuals and as institutions.